Good afternoon, everyone on the call. Welcome to today's webinar, LIHEAP Sub-recipient Fiscal Monitoring. My name is John Thompson. I am an auditor, well, actually the auditor right now with the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. And I'm very excited that everyone could join us today, and everyone's continuing to join right now. Today's webinar is going to be a lot of information for everyone, so I really hope everyone can be attentive for as long as they can over the next hour and a half. Today's webinar also features speakers from our Monitoring and Training Technical Assistance contractor, ICF, and they will be speaking about all of the information of this webinar considering around LIHEAP Sub-recipient Fiscal Monitoring. Next slide. Okay, as you listen to today's presentation, I encourage you to keep some areas in mind. One is your sub-grantees. Consider them an extension of your department. In the same way your office performs on-site monitoring to determine compliance for LIHEAP. As states being the federal pass-through entity or being the pass-through entity, your agency is required to set and implement a schedule to monitor sub-grantees. Besides the federal requirements, your own rules may require monitoring. However, you must be aware of federal requirements as well. Also keep in mind compliance. It's a federal requirement, as I just stated. And as your agency strives to use LIHEAP funds in accordance with the rules and regulations, it's equally as important that sub-grantees who receive the money are also following the same set of guidelines to expend their funds. So today's webinar will discuss statutes and guidance, uniform guidance and other requirements. Also, keep in mind training and technical assistance when performing monitoring. Usually areas of improvement are discovered that your grantee can see as an opportunity to provide, that you as the grantee can see as an opportunity to provide training and technical assistance to enhance overall operations. It's also important to that fiscal and program teams monitor together. Today, we're only going to cover fiscal monitoring, but I really hope that everyone on the call who is more on the programmatic side also considers what you can get out of today's webinar, despite the title. I would advise ongoing collaboration between program and fiscal departments. The more collaboration you have as far as LIHEAP reporting, the better the administration, your administration will be. I also want to mention that we had an earlier webinar this year of fraud, waste, and abuse. And we also will, in today's webinar, we'll also touch on how fraud, waste, and abuse can be incorporated as well into your monitoring efforts. As far as we have some materials to send out. The materials have not been uploaded yet because with Zoom, the feature, you have to upload those items to the chat. And so as everyone who's coming in, continuously coming in, will not see those materials. I'm going to upload the corresponding materials about halfway through the presentation when people stop entering the room, and that way everyone can get a chance to upload the materials. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Chetan Mahajan of ICF.
Thanks, John, and hi everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Chetan Mahajan. I'm with ICF, and today the presenters from the ICF team will be Audra Thanakari, Dee Shelkey, Blake Worthington, and Jason Clevenger. In recent years, the following four categories have consistently had the greatest number of findings from federal fiscal monitoring of grantees: administrative costs, carryover and SF 425 reporting, vendor refunds, and subrecipient fiscal monitoring. OCS has created many technical assistance resources, or TA resources, which support grantees in helping to prevent and resolve issues related to these categories. However, since these categories have had the highest number of findings, which continue to reoccur, OCS tasked the ICF team with examining existing TA resources to help identify and compile TA information from all these resources into one resource for each of these categories, which we're calling a TA guide. Today's discussion focuses on our most recent TA guide for subrecipient fiscal monitoring, and a copy of the TA guide and related handouts will be provided soon to you in the chat box. Also, a few months ago, we presented a TA guide for waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction. That's a great resource for you to refer to in parallel with the TA guide for subrecipient fiscal monitoring, so that your monitoring efforts adequately help you with overseeing program integrity for LIHEAP. And in case helpful, we're also going to provide a copy of that guide in the chat later on today. So as we'd mentioned when we presented our first TA guide last year for admin costs, each TA guide isn't developed as a perfect solution. The intent is to provide information that should be considered for efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds, and break it down as simply as possible into a series of, say, 5 to 10 questions to address. Hopefully, you can then provide feedback to us on how helpful the TA guides are with your own efforts for being efficient and compliant, and whether any information could be clarified or explained further. For subrecipient fiscal monitoring, we hope the TA guide can help you with increasing relevant awareness within your programs and ensuring that you have suitable frameworks in place to address subrecipient fiscal monitoring for LIHEAP. This guide's focus is primarily on fiscal monitoring, and we encourage you to use this guide in coordination with program monitoring as well. For example, fiscal monitoring of a client's benefit payment could be performed in tandem with program monitoring of the client's case file. So as you review the guide and think about your fiscal monitoring efforts, please also think through any relationship and impact on your program monitoring. And many different types of entities can be involved in supporting a grantee with implementing its LIHEAP program, typically based on requirements in a sub-award and or other documented requirements. These entities, some examples are listed on the slide, so I'll just read through a few of them. They could be sub-grantees, subcontractors, other state, tribal, territorial agencies, intake agencies, and also local offices of a grantee. So throughout this guide, these entities will be referred to as subrecipients. So let's go ahead and start off our discussion on the TA guide for subrecipient fiscal monitoring.
Thanks, Chetan. Hi, everyone. I'm Didi Shelke. Thanks for joining us today. So let's briefly discuss the process for developing the subrecipient fiscal monitoring guide. As previously mentioned, we examined grantees' LIHEAP monitoring reports and identified the most common issues for subrecipient fiscal monitoring. Then we studied the issues and found that they mapped to 8 common corrective actions. Next, we reviewed many of OCS's existing TA resources from the virtual library and the navigator to identify resources that provided guidance on how to address these 8 corrective actions. From this initial review, 20 resources were identified as having the most valuable information related to these corrective actions. These resources included information memorandums, or IMs, Dear Colleague letters, or DCLs, action transmittals, or ATs, webinars, and conference and regional meeting presentations. These resources were reviewed in great detail, and then contents from some of these resources, plus additional contents created by the ICF team, were used to develop a focused 27-page TA guide. So this TA guide serves as one resource that grantees can review to help address and prevent common issues instead of having to search through and review multiple resources. So in today's webinar, we'll first discuss how to use the subrecipient fiscal monitoring guide, and then we'll take you through the guide and emphasize some key points. So please refer to the guide. As John mentioned, it's going to be included as a handout to this webinar. The flow of this webinar will match the order of how information is presented in the guide. And while we won't cover all the material, we will refer you to the page numbers so that you can find the relevant information in that guide. And this icon will indicate the starting page of where you can find that relevant information. So using this webinar in concert with the guide will give you an excellent grasp of subrecipient fiscal monitoring. The guide focuses on 8 core questions that grantees should address to ensure efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds. Now let's discuss how to use the guide and review the guide structure. Okay, so the TA guide is structured to address the range of corrective actions that can arise from a category. And it's structured in a question and answers format with the corrective action listed in question form, followed by the answer, which is the guidance for how to address the corresponding corrective action. So for example, if a monitoring report required a grantee to have documented procedures for subrecipient fiscal monitoring, the corrective action in a question format would be how to document subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures. And the layout of each guide starts with the table of contents, where you'll find the introduction, common requirements and regulations, followed by the core questions to address for efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds. Then the resources section that includes links to the OCS resources that were primarily used to develop the guide. And lastly, the appendices. We won't go over the appendices today, but there's a lot of useful information and examples in them. For instance, Appendix A provides examples of the benefits of subrecipient fiscal monitoring. So please review them later on. And as we go through the core questions, we'll point you to specific appendices. Then in addition to the TA guide, you can also find a self-assessment checklist that's included as a handout to this webinar. Note that the left column in the self-assessment follows the guide's table of contents. So as you read the TA guide, reflect on the 8 core questions and document any thoughts. The checklist could help you keep track of these kind of items. What are you doing well? In those cases, there isn't much need for improvement. Areas that you want to know more about or areas where there might be an opportunity for improvement. Areas where you could share your success and help other grantees, for example, by sharing your written procedures, tools, and templates. And lastly, you could document any next steps. Now, we know a lot of grantees are doing a great job in many of these areas, but to continuously improve your programs, consider periodically revisiting this checklist to identify and resolve any opportunities for improvement. And then please reach out to OCS if you do identify any areas for which you'd like additional TA and for areas for which you'd like to share your success. Now, we also have as a handout to this webinar that provides 25 examples of subrecipient monitoring findings from LIHEAP grantees' single audits. And we obtained this information from the Federal Audit Clearinghouse and thought it might be helpful to review to get an idea for the various issues that have led to single audit findings and then how grantees address them. So the handout is an Excel file and it's organized into 2 tabs. The first tab lists 21 findings, and we've tried to map them to one or more of the 8 core questions in the Subrecipient Fiscal Monitoring TA Guide, so that after reading about a finding, you can then review the relevant core questions in the TA Guide for additional technical guidance. And as you know, each finding is based on a unique situation at a grantee, who may also have a unique program setup. So hopefully our efforts to map these findings to the core questions can point you to the technical guidance that could relate to the situation at hand. Then the second tab, it contains 4 subrecipient monitoring findings specifically related to the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or commonly referred to as CFA. The CFA serves as the primary basis that auditors use to determine which programs will be audited as part of the single audit. So it's important grantees prepare an accurate and complete CFA. We've included CFA examples as you may find it helpful to review the CFA issues noted by the auditors and the grantees' responses for those issues. And although both tabs are essentially organized the same way, we'll go over how the first tab is arranged. The core questions column includes an abbreviated core question. For example, the first core question of how to document subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures was shortened to Q1 document. However, a note in the column header does provide the full core questions as they do appear in the guide. And by using this filter feature, you can filter the findings by the core questions. And the findings could map to one core question or several. The examples are from audit periods 2017 to 2020 and are listed in chronological order, but you can filter by audit period for a specific year. Next, there's a column indicating if the finding was a repeat finding. When we filtered this column by yes, we noted that 9 out of the 21 examples, or approximately 43%, were repeat findings. So please be mindful that if corrective action plans for findings are not adequately implemented, it could lead to repeat findings for your program. We then have a column that specifies if the finding was from multiple CFDAs or the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, which is the unique identifying number for federal programs. So for a finding with yes in this column, the auditors observed that the finding not only impacted LIHEAP, but also other federal programs. For example, the Community Service Block Grant or the Department of Energy Weatherization Program. When filtering this column for yes, we noted that 4 of the 21 examples, or 19% of the time, were findings that impacted multiple federal programs. So please note that since LIHEAP is often closely operated with other federal programs, if one program has already addressed an issue and other programs have a similar issue, then the corrective action plan does not necessarily have to be created from scratch by the other programs. Next is a description of the finding, also called the condition, then the cause of the finding. Then after that, there's 3 more columns which aren't displayed on the slide, but they detail the effect of the condition, the auditor's corrective action recommendation, and then the grantee's response to the finding. And during the presentation, we will provide a few examples from this handout. And this icon will indicate the finding example number in the handout. Now, Jason will start off the discussion of the 8 core questions in the guide.
Thanks, Dee Dee. So hi, everyone. I'm Jason Clevenger, and welcome to today's webinar. And these are the 8 core questions from the guide that we will be discussing regarding subrecipient fiscal monitoring. How to document subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures. How to communicate subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures between grantee program and fiscal staff and the subrecipients. How to develop a subrecipient fiscal monitoring plan. How to incorporate a risk assessment of subrecipients into the monitoring plan. How to incorporate monitoring of subrecipients for waste, fraud, and abuse in the monitoring plan. How to select and review a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions from a subrecipient's general ledger. How to select and review a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions from a subrecipient's reimbursement request, and how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of audit and monitoring findings. For today's first poll, and we'll have a couple polls throughout today's webinar, let's stay with the 8 core questions so that you can all take a moment to pause and reflect on your program. We'll get into each in more detail soon, but at first glance, which of these 8 questions would you say are the 2 questions that your program addresses well? You may be doing all of them very well, or a few of them better than others. But for now, just pick the first 2 that come to mind. Again, here on the slide are the 8 questions that we just read through, so please take a moment to review them and type the corresponding numbers for your response in the chat pod. And again, after you've looked through these, just take a moment to think about the two that you feel that your organization is doing well, and type your responses, type the corresponding number in the chat pod. Okay, we have some 8s, some 2s coming up, some 6s and 7s, some more 2s. Again, you might be doing all of these very well, but 2 of them stand out to you. And this just helps us get a sense of some of the areas that you all feel that you're doing well and sharing with others. Some more 8s. Some more 2s, see a couple of 7s, some 6s. Great responses. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, feel free to continue to type your responses in the chat pod. It's great to see these responses. So before we go into each of these questions in detail, let's start off by briefly discussing what is subrecipient fiscal monitoring and the relevant regulations and requirements, including that grantees must monitor activities conducted under their LIHEAP program to assure compliance with applicable federal requirements and achievement of performance expectations. A grantee's fiscal monitoring of its subrecipients involves a focused formal review and testing of financial management and related administrative and operational procedures and records to monitor for compliance with relevant federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of its subaward and/or other documented requirements. Now that we've gotten an idea for what subrecipient fiscal monitoring is, let's step back and look at some relevant requirements and regulations. Now, please note that LIHEAP grantees continue to be the primary interpreters of the LIHEAP statute. HHS will accept the grantee's interpretations of the statute as long as they are in agreement with their laws and/or are not considered clearly erroneous. We've listed the common requirements and regulations on the slide. And while we won't go into detail on many of these today, please take a few moments to look over the list and refer to the guide for more information. When you want to better understand LIHEAP grant requirements and regulations, it'd be good to start with a review of the ACF and LIHEAP terms and conditions. Those are the terms and conditions you agree to in order to receive your LIHEAP grant award. Now let's start our discussion on the core questions.
Thanks, Jason. I'm Blake Worthington, and thanks again for joining us today. Let's go ahead and jump into question number 1 of today's webinar. Our first core question is how to document subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures. This is an important question because we've seen from our monitoring that some grantees did not have written, implemented subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures. When documenting these procedures, you should take into consideration that for them to be readily implementable, they should be consistent with your relevant organizational, state, tribal, or territory procedures and processes. It is the grantee's responsibility to ensure that written fiscal monitoring procedures are documented and implemented for LIHEAP subrecipient fiscal monitoring. Now let's get into the details of documenting subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures. Procedures explain how to carry out a process. For example, there may be a process for selecting a sample of transactions from a subrecipient's general ledger, and another process for how to review documentation that supports the transaction selected from the subrecipient's general ledger. For these processes and procedures, they help clarify the applicable and necessary who, what, when, where, and how details of performing the process. Procedures should ensure all who work on LIHEAP have a comprehensive understanding of LIHEAP's processes and their roles and responsibilities. Today, we'll go over a few examples of information that could be included in your subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures. But for a more comprehensive list, please refer to the guide. So for example, these procedures could specify who is responsible for the overall subrecipient fiscal monitoring process and for completing various elements within the process. What program and policy requirements are applicable to the subrecipient fiscal monitoring process? When to review and update subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures and who is responsible for updating those procedures? Where training and educational resources regarding the subrecipient fiscal monitoring processes are located, and how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of audit monitoring findings. Later in the webinar, we'll discuss how to track these activities. But before we move to the next core question, I wanted to mention that the guide also includes some helpful tips for writing procedures. Our next core question is how to communicate subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures between grantee program and fiscal staff and to subrecipients. Subrecipient fiscal monitoring procedures should be communicated to the relevant personnel who are responsible for performing monitoring-related job functions to help ensure compliance with monitoring regulations and requirements. Also, procedures should be communicated between program and fiscal staff, especially staff that oversee subrecipients' day-to-day activities. LIHEAP program staff should consider LIHEAP fiscal staff as key communication partners, as LIHEAP has a significant fiscal component. If program and fiscal staff continuously collaborate and understand each other's procedures and work together to improve them, then the outcome will be a stronger program. Here are some common communication methods between grantee program and fiscal staff. First, there's the grantee's monitoring plan, which will provide detailed guidance on how to develop a subrecipient's fiscal monitoring plan in our next core question. Next, the grantee's operational manual. This is one of the most important documents that a grantee can utilize to communicate monitoring procedures and requirements to its staff. Another communication method is meetings. Please refer to the guide for suggestions on who should attend these meetings, when meetings should occur, and what should be discussed. And lastly, training and technical assistance sessions. Grantees should provide training and technical assistance to monitoring staff to help ensure the monitoring plan, procedures, and requirements are understood by all relevant personnel. During these sessions, grantees should welcome and listen to suggestions and feedback from all staff.
Thanks, Blake. Hi, everyone. I'm Audra Thanakary. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Next, we will cover communication methods to subrecipients. It is important to note that grantees should notify subrecipients of 45 CFR 75.352D, which requires grantees to monitor activities as necessary to ensure that subawards are used for authorized purposes in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the subaward, and that subaward performance goals are achieved. Some common communication methods to subrecipients include the grantee's LIHEAP operations manual, subrecipient contracts or other agreements. So subrecipient contracts or agreements that specify monitoring requirements are strongly encouraged to help prevent misunderstandings. Annual contracts or agreements are recommended so that if requirements or situations with subrecipients change, grantees ensure the most relevant and up-to-date information is in the contracts or agreements to run an effective program. Also, please consider that some of your subrecipients have their own subrecipients that they should monitor. If your subrecipient has its own LIHEAP subrecipients, for example, a subrecipient weatherization agency has its own subrecipients, you should consider formalizing additional detailed requirements and responsibilities, such as a process for you to review the monitoring reports from your subrecipient's monitoring of its LIHEAP subrecipients. From our monitoring, we observed one grantee that not only reviews monitoring reports from the sub-grantee's monitoring of its LIHEAP subrecipients, but also the grantee accompanies the subrecipient on its on-site monitoring of its weatherization subrecipients. Participating in the on-site monitoring gives the grantee valuable insight into their subrecipient's monitoring process and a much more thorough understanding of how the program operates on the ground. Please refer to the guide for an example excerpt from a grantee's LIHEAP weatherization agreement outlining the subrecipient's monitoring requirements. And at Appendix B, you can find an example of monitoring and compliance requirements in a grantee's subrecipient agreement. Another common communication method is training and technical assistance sessions. And lastly, conferences. Conferences could serve as an opportunity for grantees to talk with their subrecipients about monitoring requirements and any specific trends noted for monitoring findings. So now let's talk about how to develop a subrecipient fiscal monitoring plan. A subrecipient fiscal monitoring plan can be developed by documenting a set of comprehensive steps. The monitoring plan will differ for each LIHEAP grantee because the nature of the organization, staffing, and the design of each grantee's program influences the monitoring plan. A successful LIHEAP monitoring plan should allow for a comparison of what is required, what was planned, and what actually happened through examination and testing. Allow for the identification of findings and concerns that need corrective actions. Be based on the grantee's program characteristics, requirements, and goals. And your monitoring plan should ensure that subrecipients are using LIHEAP funds for authorized purposes and in the most impactful and efficient manner. Next, we'll take a look at the steps to complete a subrecipient monitoring. Common steps to complete subrecipient fiscal monitoring are listed on the slide. The process starts with assessing risks so that you can then select subrecipients for monitoring and determine the frequency of monitoring. After completing step 1, you could complete steps 2 through 11 for each subrecipient selected for review. Also, you can adjust these steps as necessary and in compliance with your own monitoring requirements. All of the steps on the slide are important, but over the next few slides, we are going to highlight a few key steps. For detailed information on each step, please refer to the guide. Okay, so for today, we are going to focus on step 1, assess risk to select subrecipients and determine frequency of monitoring. Step 6, conduct interviews and document observations. Step 8, send a monitoring report. Step 9, track findings and resolutions of corrective actions. And step 10, provide training and technical assistance. The first step is to assess risk in order to select subrecipients for monitoring and determine the frequency of monitoring. So first, you should select subrecipients based on an established risk-based approach so that subrecipients with higher assessed risks are prioritized for monitoring. In our next core question, we will go over step-by-step guidance on how to incorporate a risk assessment into your monitoring plan. Next, determine the frequency of monitoring. There's not a specific rule on how frequently monitoring must occur. However, more frequent monitoring can lead to potential issues being discovered sooner. Risk assessment results can help determine the frequency of monitoring. For example, higher risk subrecipients may need to be monitored more frequently than lower risk subrecipients. Each grantee's frequency for monitoring will differ due to varying factors such as budget constraints, the number of subrecipients involved, staffing, and the design of its LIHEAP program. Another important feature of monitoring is timeliness. Timely monitoring conducted while program operations are still ongoing for the year allow monitors to observe if activities are taking place in accordance with required procedures, while there is still time to make corrections. Please see the guide for examples of common subrecipient monitoring schedules.
Thanks, Audra. The next step we will discuss is to conduct interviews and document observations. For this step, you can interview the subrecipient staff to learn more about its operations, such as internal controls, separation of duties, and computer data security. You can also discuss selected general ledger transactions and their supporting documentation with appropriate staff. And when selecting transactions, it's important to select enough transactions to be able to adequately assess compliant and efficient use of funds. And then document the interviews and observations to explain the basis for any findings and the sources of information used to arrive at the conclusions. And then another important step is to send a monitoring report to the subrecipient. The report should be sent within an established time frame to create an official record of recommendations and findings and their required corrective actions. A comprehensive monitoring report should clearly describe recommendations and findings and their required corrective actions. Mention if the subrecipient is experiencing problems or failing to comply with federal requirements or program guidelines. Include instructions on how the subrecipient should submit proposed resolutions to any findings. Include deadlines for the subrecipient's responses. And also include any of the subrecipient's strengths noted during the review. Next steps are to track findings and resolutions of corrective actions, in which you first, for all subrecipients, track their findings and required corrective actions with the associated deadlines. Then track their responses, including evaluating the responses and supporting documents, if applicable, to determine whether the findings have been corrected. Follow up with the subrecipient if responses are past due or if clarification is needed on the responses. Then close out each finding once resolved. And later in the webinar, we'll discuss in more detail how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of audit and monitoring findings. Okay, to close out this core question, we're going to discuss providing training and technical assistance. So for successful training and technical assistance, look for trends in monitoring findings. To provide better training and technical assistance to address common concerns. Develop and enhance training and technical assistance to ensure program integrity and to promote continual learning that improves your program. Also, review prior monitoring findings, and if similar issues arise, consider addressing them in the trainings offered to all subrecipients. And if a specific issue comes up repeatedly at one subrecipient, consider providing targeted training and technical assistance to that subrecipient. And today's webinar is an example of us performing this step within our monitoring process. As mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we looked for trends within our monitoring findings and identified subrecipient fiscal monitoring as one of the most common concerns amongst grantees. So we developed this training for all grantees to enhance program integrity and promote continual learning that improves LIHEAP.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Now let's move on to question 4, which is how to incorporate a risk assessment of subrecipients into a monitoring plan. According to 45 CFR 75.352b, grantees are required to evaluate subrecipients' risk of noncompliance to determine the appropriate monitoring activities. When determining how you will evaluate your subrecipient's risk of noncompliance, please consider what works best for your program. There are many suitable methods for evaluating subrecipient risk. However, a common method is to develop and use a risk assessment tool. Over the next couple of slides, we'll walk through an example 6-step approach for developing a risk assessment tool. Before we walk through these steps, we wanted to point out that it is commonly accepted industry best practice for a subrecipient risk assessment process to be performed annually. And there are many LIHEAP grantees evaluate subrecipient risk prior to issuing sub-grant agreements and funds to subrecipients, so that if necessary, a grantee can add additional terms and conditions to the sub-grant agreement of higher risk subrecipients. After this webinar, if you would like more information on the benefits of utilizing a subrecipient risk assessment tool, please see Appendix C in the guide. Okay, now let's discuss examples of steps for developing a risk assessment tool. Step 1 is to determine the risk factors. There are many risk factors to consider when assessing subrecipient risk. A comprehensive risk assessment tool should include both programmatic and fiscal risk factors, and both program and fiscal staff should work together when evaluating subrecipient risk to help ensure all relevant risk factors are being considered. Over the next few slides, we'll go over a few examples of risk factors. Regulation 45 CFR 75 352B includes the following suggested risk factors: the subrecipient's prior experience with the same or similar subawards. For example, new LIHEAP subrecipients could be a higher risk of noncompliance than a subrecipient who has been administrating LIHEAP for many years. Next, the results of a previous single audit, including whether the subrecipient received a single audit. Several risk factors can be evaluated by reviewing single audit results. For example, subrecipient risk can be evaluated based on the significance or impact of a finding on LIHEAP, including whether a finding is a repeat finding, whether a finding resulted in question cost, or whether a finding has been corrected. Other risk factors include whether the subrecipient has new personnel or new or substantially changed systems, and the extent and results of HHS awarding agency monitoring. For example, for other HHS programs, if the subrecipient also receives federal funds directly from HHS awarding agency. Some additional factors to consider when assessing subrecipient risk include findings and results of previous monitoring performed by the grantee, including both fiscal and program issues, and findings and results from previous audits or reviews performed by oversight agencies. For example, the grantee's audit office or Office of Inspector General. We have several more risk factors to share, and please take a moment to review them. So to conclude this step, we wanted to highlight that when you're determining which risk factors to include in your risk assessment tool, it is important to select risk factors that have reliable and quantifiable data. If your risk assessment tool does not include reliable data, then it will not procure reliable results.
Thanks, Blake. Okay, that leads us to step 2, collect data. After you determine the set of risk factors that are most relevant for your program and subrecipients, next you will need to collect the necessary data to evaluate each risk factor. Data sources could include your LIHEAP department. You already maintain a lot of information necessary to evaluate your subrecipient's risk. For example, the results and timing of your previous subrecipient monitoring, award amount, and the status of audit and monitoring corrective action plans. Next, there's the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, or FAC. Data regarding subrecipients' single audits can be found on FAC. For example, audit findings for LIHEAP and other similar federal programs, and the date the audit was completed and submitted to FAC. Another source is other internal, state, tribal, or territorial departments. For example, other federal program departments or audit departments. Next, data can be obtained from a subrecipient risk questionnaire or self-assessment. During monitoring site visits, we have learned that some grantees send questionnaires or self-assessments to their subrecipients to collect relevant data for assessing subrecipients' risk of noncompliance. These risk questionnaires or self-assessments could include questions on whether the subrecipient has any new or substantially changed systems that affect LIHEAP operations, whether the subrecipient has experienced issues with other federal programs, and information on the subrecipient's internal oversight and internal controls. We have also noticed that some grantees require their subrecipients to sign and certify that the information provided in the questionnaire or self-assessment is complete and accurate. Data can also come from the IRS Form 990. If your subrecipients are nonprofits, data from the IRS Form 990 could be reviewed to assess risks related to the subrecipient's overall financial health. And lastly, data can be collected from a reliable source of news or information obtained via general internet search. Sometimes these sources may help you gather publicly available insight on your subrecipients. Just make sure it's reliable, and then you can figure out whether and how to quantify it for risk if needed. The third step is to quantify and score risk factor data. You should quantify and score each risk factor's data point by assigning it a numerical value based on how significantly it could impact LIHEAP, and/or given the type of risk factor, how likely it could lead to subrecipient noncompliance. A 1 through 5 scoring scale is recommended for simplicity and easy interpretation, although you could decide to use a 1 through 10 scale or any other numerical scoring scale. Regardless of your scoring scale, usually higher risk data elements are assigned higher numerical values. For example, when using a 1 through 5 scale, higher risk data elements should receive a risk score of 5, while lower risk data elements should receive a risk score of 1. Let's walk through an example of how to quantify and score data. If a risk assessment tool includes the risk factor of turnover in the past 2 years for key LIHEAP personnel, such as a program director or fiscal lead, this risk factor could be scored as 1, which is low risk for 0 changes, 3, which is medium risk for 1 to 2 changes, and 5, which is high risk for 3 or more changes in key LIHEAP personnel. Your scoring methodology should be easy to follow and foster consistent interpretation and application by different staff members. The scoring methodology could be documented within the risk assessment tool to promote this consistent interpretation and application. For the fourth step, you should calculate each subrecipient's overall risk score. Calculating the overall risk score can be done by summing the risk scores for each risk factor. Besides summing risk scores, there are other ways to arrive at a subrecipient's overall risk score, such as using weighted averages. If you want to consider that each risk factor might not equally impact your program, you could think about using weighted averages to calculate the subrecipient's overall risk score. For example, if your risk factors include period of time since last site visit and known cases of fraud, you could determine that a known case of fraud would have a greater impact on your program than the amount of time since the subrecipient's last site visit. and therefore the fraud risk factor should be weighted more heavily when calculating the subrecipient's overall risk score.
Thanks, Audra. The fifth step is to sort and rank subrecipients. For this step, you should sort and rank subrecipients from highest to lowest based on their overall risk score. And by doing this, you can see how one subrecipient compares to the rest in terms of risk. Then the final step in this process is to assign a risk level to each subrecipient. And you should assign each subrecipient a risk level of either high, medium, or low. For example, you could define risk levels as subrecipients listed within the top 70 to 100% of the list are considered higher risk compared to the other subrecipients. Subrecipients listed within the bottom 0 to 30% of the list are considered lower risk. And then subrecipients listed anywhere between the high and the low risk thresholds are considered medium risk. To have an effective risk assessment tool, customize your tool to suit your program. And remember that a risk assessment tool should be a working document that is continuously improved over time. And please refer to the guide for information on how to maintain an effective risk assessment tool. And at Appendix D, you can find an example risk assessment tool.
Phoebe. Now let's have another poll question. For this poll, we want to know, what is your role in monitoring subrecipients? There's no right or wrong answer here, and you might find that in your organization, you do a combination of these. So feel free to select all that may apply. So do you A, monitor subrecipients by yourself and or with a team? Do you B, supervise staff that monitors subrecipients? C, use another organizational department or unit to monitor LIHEAP subrecipients? Or D, do you utilize an independent contractor to monitor your LIHEAP subrecipients? As we did with the prior poll, please type your corresponding letter for all of the answers that apply for your LIHEAP program into the chat pod. And we're seeing a large mix. Looks like there's a lot of A's, B's, C's, and D's. Everybody is representing a different role. It's interesting to see some are doing all, some might just be doing one part. So depending on how your organization's made up and how your role relates to subrecipient monitoring, but thanks for taking the time to answer that. It looks like it's a pretty good spread across the board on everyone's roles in this process. So thank you for all of these responses. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just helpful to get some insight on the different roles and responsibilities that we have for LIHEAP subrecipient fiscal monitoring. Now we'll go on to the fifth question of how to incorporate monitoring of subrecipients for waste, fraud, and abuse into the monitoring plan. According to 45 CFR 96.84C, grantees must establish appropriate systems and procedures to prevent, detect, report, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse by clients, vendors, and administrating agencies such as subrecipients. These requirements could be addressed in your monitoring plan by ensuring that waste, fraud, and abuse measures and indicators are incorporated in the risk assessment, ensuring that subrecipients are abiding by your requirement for preventing, detecting, and correcting waste, fraud, and abuse, providing training to subrecipients, especially on policies and procedures that they're not aware of, performing data analytics on selected general ledgers to identify unusual transactions for further analysis and discussion, such as duplicate transactions or round dollar amounts, And then finally, reviewing internal controls to ensure they adequately support the integrity and efficiency of subrecipient operations as intended, especially when maintaining compliance with LIHEAP rules, regulations, and all LIHEAP assurances. Please see the guide for examples of grantees' fraud-related questions from its subrecipient monitoring questionnaire, and see Appendix E for examples of measures to support oversight for waste, fraud, and abuse. Now let's close out this core question with an example from the subrecipient monitoring audit findings handout that we mapped the core question in incorporating waste, fraud, and abuse into the monitoring plan. For this example, the findings condition was that 2 subrecipients at 1 grantee misused LIHEAP funds. However, please note that not all mismanagement results in waste, fraud, or abuse, especially if mismanagement is identified and adequately resolved prior to the instance of waste, fraud, and abuse. And effective management is needed to be able to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, so for subrecipient 1, the grantee initially became aware of possible mismanagement of funds when a utility vendor claimed it was not receiving timely payments from the subrecipient. In response, the grantee heightened its monitoring efforts over the subrecipient. But these efforts did not successfully mitigate the misuse of LIHEAP funds. So the grantee eliminated the subrecipient from the payment process and began paying the utility vendor directly. Additionally, the grantee hired a forensic auditing firm that determined the subrecipient misused LIHEAP funds during a 3-year period. The effect of this condition was until complaints from the utility vendor, the grantee was not fully aware of the extent or magnitude of its subrecipient's misuse of LIHEAP funds due to inadequate fiscal monitoring practices. The grantee's response was that they had developed a LIHEAP fiscal monitoring tool. For the second subrecipient, the grantee first became aware of possible mismanagement of funds when 3 dozen fuel vendors complained that a subrecipient had not made a significant number of outstanding payments for heating oil deliveries to households that were receiving LIHEAP assistance. The effect of this condition was that until a number of utility vendors brought it to the grantee's attention, the grantee was not fully aware of the extent or magnitude of its subrecipient's misuse of LIHEAP funds due to inadequate fiscal monitoring practices. The grantee's response was that they developed a monitoring tool. So please refer to the handout for more details and a reminder that the grantee's LIHEAP program and each subrecipient is unique. So monitoring plans, policies, and procedures will vary from entity to entity. Also note that while reviewing the examples in the household related to this core, in the handout related to this core question, you could find it helpful to refer to the LIHEAP Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Prevention, Detection, Correction Guide in the handout. In addition to waste, fraud, and abuse, the guide has more information regarding mismanagement.
Thanks, Blake. So now let's talk about how to select and review a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions from a subrecipient's general ledger. For subrecipient fiscal monitoring to be effective, it should include reviewing a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions and their supporting documents to help ensure that LIHEAP funds are used for authorized purposes and in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. Also, since LIHEAP grantees certify in their annual LIHEAP plan that they will adhere to the 16 federal LIHEAP statutory assurances, it is vital that subrecipient monitoring incorporates a relevant assessment of compliance with these assurances. See Appendix F for examples of how subrecipient fiscal monitoring is used to assess compliance with LIHEAP assurances. When selecting a sample from a subrecipient's GL, first review the GL to make sure the data is complete and appropriate. For example, review the GL to ensure that data is presented at the transaction level. Data is presented in a format that allows for sorting, filtering, and searching. Expenditures and receipts are included. Total balances agree with the grantee's financial records. For example, you can compare total receipts of LIHEAP funds on the subrecipient's GL to your own disbursement records to ensure the data is consistent. Next, ensure the transactions are from the specific period selected for review, and that detailed information is provided for each transaction, such as date, amount, payee, and a description that identifies the type of expense, for example, benefits, admin, weatherization, and assurance 16. Sample selections should include a variety of transactions. For example, large and small dollar amounts and transactions that occur at various times throughout the program year. From the subrecipient's GL, you should select a sample of transactions from the following categories as applicable: benefits and direct program costs, services to reduce home energy needs or assurance 16, administrative costs, and refunds, including vendor refunds. Additionally, when selecting a sample of transactions from a subrecipient's GL, you should consider including the following types of transactions in your selection. Unusual transactions. You can perform data analytics to identify unusual transactions, such as transactions occurring on weekends or holidays, or transactions with unusually large or small dollar amounts. Transactions with questionable or vague descriptions, and higher risk transactions. You could review the risk assessment tool and select sample transactions based on risk factors that received high scores. For example, if a subrecipient received a high risk score based on prior monitoring findings regarding a non-compliant allocation of rent charges to LIHEAP, you should include rent expenditures in your GL selections. Okay, now let's briefly discuss sample sizes. When determining your sample size, please remember that sample sizes should be sufficient enough to obtain adequate representation of the data being verified. For more information on how to determine sample sizes, please refer to the guide. After making your sample selections and obtaining supporting documentation from the subrecipients, you should review the supporting documents to help verify that the selected LIHEAP transactions are valid and completely supported. Examples of supporting documents are listed on the slide.
Thanks, Audra. So as previously mentioned, you should review supporting documents to verify that the selected transactions are valid and have a complete set of supporting information. To verify whether a transaction is valid, confirm the following from the supporting information. The transaction was necessary to meet the intended purposes for LIHEAP, and transaction was in compliance with federal, state, tribal, territorial requirements. And to verify whether supporting documents are complete, you could confirm that the transaction details from the GL agree with supporting documents, including the date, payee, dollar amount, transaction type, and description. Also, confirm that the transaction was processed in accordance with relevant internal controls, such as review and approval controls. For example, ensure the review dates and the reviewer and approver's signatures are clearly presented in the supporting documents. Lastly, confirm that the transaction is explained. That is, the purpose of the transaction is readily understandable from a review of the GL details and discussions with the subrecipient staff if needed. And keep in mind that you should formally document the review process, including a description of the supporting documents and the methodology and results of performing the verification steps for each sample selection. Okay, so let's close out this core question with an example from the Subrecipient Monitoring Audit Findings handout that we categorized under the Review GL core question. This finding contains a lot of information from the auditor's testing with very specific examples, but for brevity, we've summarized the details. So please refer to the handout. Okay, so the findings condition was that the monitoring completed by the grantee did not include testing of all expense categories reimbursed with LIHEAP funds. And the grantee's monitoring files did not contain sufficient evidence for the auditor to determine what procedures were performed for detailed testing of the expenditures. The effect of this condition was that there is an increased risk for the misuse of funds, of federal funds, and non-compliance with federal regulations when adequate monitoring is not performed. The grantee's response was that they will be producing a new policy and procedures manual outlining program guidance and requirements. And a reminder that each grantee's LIHEAP program and each subrecipient is unique. So the procedures for reviewing LIHEAP transactions from a subrecipient's GL will vary from entity to entity. So now let's look at question number 7. How to select and review a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions from a subrecipient's reimbursement request. And keep in mind that subrecipient oversight and monitoring is a continuous process, and it should include review of subrecipient activities and reporting on a regular basis. For example, a review of reimbursement requests and supporting documents. To effectively review reimbursements, select a sample of all types of LIHEAP transactions from a subrecipient reimbursement request and review the associated supporting documents to help ensure that LIHEAP funds are used for authorized purposes and in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. So the process for selecting a sample and reviewing supporting documentation from a subrecipient's reimbursement request is similar to the GL process that was discussed in the previous core question. And it's recommended that reviews of reimbursement requests occur on an ongoing basis to identify and correct potential issues sooner rather than later and help avoid having unallowable cost. So this proactive approach can also help you identify subrecipients that may need a more thorough review, such as an on-site compliance review, or need additional support, such as TA, for the issues observed.
Thanks, Dee. Our last core question is how to track activities for timely and appropriate resolution of audit monitoring findings. As described in 45 CFR 75.352B2, grantees are required to follow up and ensure that subrecipients are taking timely and appropriate action to resolve all deficiencies detected through audits, site visits, or other types of reviews. To help comply with the requirement mentioned on the previous slide, you should review your subrecipients' audit reports, including single audit reports and monitoring reports and corrective action plans for LIHEAP findings. And then discuss findings with your subrecipients to help ensure they fully understand the findings and are taking appropriate steps to implement corrective action and resolve findings. Relevant information from these reports and discussions with subrecipients could then be documented and tracked to ensure that adequate records are maintained for the timely identification of resolution of each finding. Now let's discuss examples of information that could be included in the tracking system. An effective tracking system could consist of a schedule of dates for key activities to allow for timely follow-up and notes regarding the finding, corrective action, and key activities. Let's first discuss examples of key dates to include in your tracking system. And on the next slide, we'll go over examples of notes that could be included in your tracking system. Dates for key activities include audit report submission due date, for example, due date for a subrecipient to submit the single audit report to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and due date for the subrecipient to submit a copy of its annual audit report to the grantee if required. Date when the audit report was received from the subrecipient, date when the monitoring report was issued, date when the finding was discussed with the subrecipient, corrective action due date and the actual date completed, and corrective action closeout date in the grantee's records. That is the date the finding was closed out by the grantee as having been adequately resolved. So in addition to key dates, an effective tracking system could also consist of notes regarding the finding, corrective action, and key activities to enable a reviewer to get a concise understanding of each finding and progress of its corrective action. These notes could include a description of the finding, including the cause and identification number. When reviewing each finding, pay attention to repeat findings and findings with question cost. A description of the corrective action, discussions and other correspondence with the subrecipient regarding the finding and corrective action, the current status of corrective action as either not started yet, in process, or completed, and current assessment of the corrective action.
Thanks, Blake. So next we wanted to provide a few tips that support effective use of a tracking system. Training could be provided to staff on how to use the system, including how and where the system will be stored. For example, in a shared documentation repository, and how and where notes need to be entered in the system. A staff person could be assigned the responsibility of ensuring that the tracking system is kept up to date and is operating as needed, including notifying subrecipients and relevant grantee staff when items are due from them. And depending on how notes are categorized in the tracking system, data from the tracking system could also be used to support program effectiveness by identifying any needs for training and technical assistance to help resolve findings and prevent additional findings. During our site visits, we've observed many different ways grantees are tracking activities for timely and appropriate resolution of audit and monitoring findings. For example, one grantee uses a shared Google Drive that allows all the grantees' programs to save their monitoring reports on the same drive so that they can view each other's monitoring reports to identify any common issues. If one program has already addressed an issue at a subrecipient and other programs have similar issues, then the corrective action plan can be used as reference. For more examples, please refer to the guide. Now let's revisit Regulation 45 CFR 75.352D2 that we mentioned at the beginning of this core question, which requires grantees to follow up and ensure that subrecipients are taking timely and appropriate action to resolve all deficiencies detected through audits, site visits, or other types of reviews. Well, we noted in the subrecipient monitoring audit findings handout that out of 21 findings, there were 10, or approximately 50%, related to inadequate tracking of audit findings. We've summarized these findings on the slide. The findings conditions were the initial monitoring report was not issued in the grantee's required timeframe. Corrective actions were not received in the grantee's required timeframe. And the grantees did not adequately track when audits were due. The effect of the findings conditions was that there is an increased risk federal awards may continue to be used for disallowed purposes without adequate follow-up on corrective actions, and grantees cannot ensure they comply with federal law and issues management decisions timely without reviewing subrecipient audits in a timely manner. The grantee's responses to these findings are listed on the slide, so please take a moment to review them. And please refer to the handout for more details on these findings. And you can identify these findings by filtering for Q8 track findings in the core questions column, and also a reminder that each grantee's LIHEAP program and each subrecipient is unique, so tracking systems will vary from entity to entity. Okay, great. It's time for another poll. And now that we've discussed all of the 8 core questions in more detail, for this poll, let's regroup and take some time to reflect on each. At the start of our webinar, we asked you to think about which of these your program was doing well. Now we want to ask you to think about the one question that you'd like to study further, either in the TA guide or from your own review of resources. Again, you may already be addressing this question well, but you'd still like to examine it soon as you want to learn more about it. So please type the corresponding number for your response in the chat pod. Again, which of the 8 core questions would you like to review more, either in the TA guide or from a review of your own resources? Okay, it's kind of different answers, a couple of 5s, some more 4s, letting us know a lot of you would like to dig a little deeper into incorporating a risk assessment for subrecipients into the monitoring plan. And also looking at how to incorporate a review of waste, fraud, and abuse of subrecipients into the monitoring plan. Great. Yeah, please feel free to keep answering. It's good to know which of these core questions you'd want to dig into a little bit further in the guide. So quite a mix. Some more 4s, some more 7s. Okay, great. Thank you for your responses. Getting some more 7s. And again, there's no wrong answers here. For the question that you did select to examine further, please go ahead and do that review when you can. We've found that we often have so much we're curious about and want to learn about, but taking it one question at a time should hopefully help you with prioritizing your learning and doing it at a pace that works well for you.
Thanks, Jason. Let's all do a quick wrap up now. So as you can see, our vision for the TA guide is to provide you with targeted guidance in a format that's easy to read and easy to implement. And as you all read the guide and share it with your teams for further review and discussion, think about your LIHEAP program's strengths and weaknesses, identify any areas where improvements could be made, and then make those enhancements to your program. The self-assessment checklist should help you with documenting this information in one place. And please provide feedback to OCS if additional clarification would be helpful, or if you have ideas for additional items to include in the next version of the TA guide for subrecipient fiscal monitoring. It would especially be helpful for us if you could provide feedback on where you think you've got strong procedures, tools, and templates that you could share with us so that we can learn from them and share them with other grantees. Here are some of the resources that we found were very helpful to develop content for the guide. After you've reviewed the guide, you could review these resources as well if you'd like to study them further. These resources are also in the resources section of the guide. And the resources we discussed were all found on the virtual library, OCS website, and Navigator. They're all great places to look for a variety of TA content, and you can do keyword searches to help look for anything specific. And I want to let you know that OCS is planning on sending you a survey soon to evaluate the training that we provided today. Please complete the survey so that we can get your feedback and keep trying to support you and your teams as best as we can with technical assistance for LIHEAP. Thank you for all your time, and John, back to you.
Thanks, Chet. Just a lot of information there. First of all, I want to thank everyone for really hanging in there and for the duration of the webinar. There's a lot of information discussed, and I definitely encourage everyone to go back and look at it again, or look at the guides, the handouts that were put on the chat box. I will also, if for anyone that has not received the handouts, the guides, please just let me know in the chat box or reach out to me. A lot of information was discussed. Just some key points I thought was the communication that was mentioned, the communication methods between the program and fiscal staff, and also with your sub-recipients. And as was also mentioned a lot in the chat box, was how to develop a risk assessment tool within your monitoring plan. That's very key, because developing your risk assessment tool really determines what areas you can target, and provides more focus in your monitoring, as well as incorporating waste, fraud, and abuse into your monitoring plan. I also wanted to encourage everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, to go back and review the webinar on waste, fraud, and abuse. That could also provide some insight into incorporating that element into your monitoring plan. And so there were just many examples that were provided also by ICF, and examples of findings. And so hopefully everyone was observing those findings, and so your agency cannot possibly prevent your agency can prevent replication of those findings. So we will be recorded. This webinar is recorded, and we will post it on our website within a few weeks. Once all the information is gathered and verified, we'll have that for everyone to come back as a reference. So this PowerPoint will be included in that recording. And as Chetan mentioned earlier, please go and perform the self-assessments, review your documents, and if needed, please go back and improve your process. If you already have a monitoring plan, it's a good time to revisit that and to improve your process. And lastly, I just want to encourage, thank you, all of our partners out there who are definitely in the front lines, with the distribution of LIHEAP to all the eligible applicants, and making sure that the LIHEAP program is not only a very visible program, which it is, but we're maximizing it the most that we can. I know right now, at the end of this fiscal year, everyone is trying to make sure that they haven't obligated all of their ARP funds yet to incorporate plans to do that, if not already. So we really thank you for all of your hard work, as last year it was the push to obligate, expend all of our CARES Act funding, and this year's the ARP funding. And as you know, tomorrow is the last day to obligate those funds. And so we definitely appreciate all your efforts to do that, because ultimately it's the participants of the program for LIHEAP who benefit from your efforts. And as a recap, once again, my name is John Thompson. I'm the auditor here at LIHEAP, and you can always go on our website, our OCS website, and look at not only myself, as my information is right there, but also our our LIHEAP contacts that we have here at the office. Should you have any questions about how to, any questions about the LIHEAP program, as you all constantly reach out to us anyway. So by now you already know, hopefully, who your program contacts are, but we are constantly adding contacts within the LIHEAP program. So please constantly check the website to see who your new program liaison could be, as we are constantly adding staff here on the programmatic side. So I encourage you to do that. So now we're at the Q&A section of our of the webinar. We have about 5 minutes left before we sign off. And if anyone has any questions, you can type that into the chat box. But right now, as I'm reviewing the chat right now, I see mostly it's around just uploading the guide and making sure that's available. So I will go ahead and do that at the conclusion of the webinar, and I'll also upload. I will also upload our website as well. Now, if there aren't any questions, I can go over a question real quick that we faced before in the past, or been asked before in the past. One question is, as a grantee, one of the biggest challenges with being able to conduct formal monitoring of subrecipients is trying to schedule time to conduct monitoring activities, especially with packed work schedules, given all of the operational work that happens for LIHEAP and other programs at the grantee and sub-grantee level. So how do we address something like this? So I'm going to ask Chetan of ICF if he could provide a response for that type of scenario.
Sure, John. So, we definitely understand that. My team does monitoring and related grants management work as our core work. And we also have a challenge with coordinating schedules and making sure adequate time is set aside for monitoring. In my team's case, the real challenge is a staffing issue. So as a team, we need to keep planning out whether we have enough suitable staff available to do the monitoring, especially when there's travel involved at different times of the year. So if you look at your programs, you might be able to readily know what the real challenge is. Is it a lack of staff, or it could be that your monitoring processes aren't easy to implement by a lean staffing model, or it could be that you need to first develop a formal monitoring plan and schedule, and then get buy-in from your agency leadership for it to be prioritized. So hopefully you can address the root cause or root causes to make it easier to then schedule your monitoring activities.
Thanks, Chetan.
Sure.
I really appreciate the response. And lastly, before we sign off, I have another question that's been proposed to us before. Each of our subrecipients meets the dollar threshold of requiring a single audit each year. So why can't we rely on the single audit process to identify any issues with our subrecipients instead of having to do a separate monitoring on our own? Once again, Chet, I'm going to ask if you can address that question.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question, and something we've been asked about during our own monitoring of grantees. So monitoring shouldn't be seen as a duplication of efforts from the single audit. In the single audit, independent auditors test compliance with very specific requirements as listed in the compliance supplement for single audits. Your monitoring should ideally be going beyond the end of year specific requirements to examining daily, weekly, and monthly operational interactions that you have with your subrecipients. Also, with timely monitoring, you can get the benefit of being able to better prevent issues before they become a single audit finding. And then you can then share lessons learned with other subrecipients to help them too with preventing similar issues. And what I think is most important, unlike a single audit that's done by an independent auditor, you and your team conduct monitoring, and you can benefit from that. You have that ongoing relationship and rapport in place with your subrecipients, and can use monitoring to grow and strengthen your shared knowledge on an ongoing basis to keep making adjustments and improvements as needed, just to keep serving LIHEAP clients as best as you can.
Thanks, Chetan. And I definitely agree with the sentiment of just having that relationship already in place to enhance what's already monitoring that's in place. So I really appreciate the response there. And then also for if there are any tribes on the call, I want to encourage you that you may not have sub-recipients, but towards the end of the webinar, when it was discussed about tracking, you can use points from what was discussed in how to do tracking and really incorporate that into your efforts and how you communicate with your vendors. If your vendors issue out energy to eligible applicants, you can just establish a very effective way of how you're tracking payments that go out, and establish an effective tracking system internally. And then by doing that, you'll be able to keep pace with your vendor about any payments that have been processed, that have went out, and having an effective obligation and expenditure system that you're reviewing, and just make your LIHEAP program that more efficient. You can also incorporate that with other programs as well. So I just want everyone on the call, and even if you don't have subrecipients per se, to really think outside the box about how this webinar can that what was discussed in this webinar can really enhance your LIHEAP program. I see that we're of time right now. There's one question in the chat box. I can't really make out what's being asked there. I would encourage you, if you could just reach out to me individually and send me your question so I can read through it more thoroughly. I think it's Sandy Wade. If you could send that to me, if you could reach out to me at john.thompson@acf.hhs.gov. I really would appreciate that, because I definitely want to get to, I want to answer your question effectively, but I'm not really understanding what's being asked there, unless Chetan, if you see that in the chat box and you're able to understand what's there. I really can't right now.
Yeah, no, I think more information would be helpful.
Yeah. So Sandy, if you're still there, please reach out to me, and I can answer your question more effectively. So thank you everyone for joining today. Really appreciate everyone's participation and hanging there in this webinar, especially during close time of the fiscal year. All the best, everyone. Thank you for your efforts with the LIHEAP program. And we'll see you later for the next webinar, next fiscal year. Thank you so much.